Everyone always talks about the one chart
The one.
that predicts a recession every single time, the yield curve. And other than that one time in the 1960s where there was a false positive, it has been right almost every single time. But what if I told you that there was more than one chart that predicted a recession every single time? And what if I also told you that all of those charts are pointing to the exact same thing at this exact moment? And no, I'm not talking about the lipstick index and the underwear index and all the kind of quasi crazy indexes that are out there predicting a recession. I'm talking about three legitimate economic indices that are almost always 100% accurate when it comes to predicting the next big downturn. But before I get into all the details, my name is Nolan Matthias, and if you want the truth about personal finance and you believe that there is always opportunity in crisis, then this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss the three charts that always predict a recession. And we're going to start with the obvious one, which is the yield curve. This is the one that there are hundreds of articles about, hundreds of YouTube videos about, and it talks about the fact that when the yield curve starts uninverting, it is almost always a sign that a recession is right around the corner. And for the most part, this is true, although not always. There was a time in the 1960s where we didn't end up in a full-blown recession. It was just more of a mild downturn, although the uninverting yield curve did in fact point to the fact that there was going to be a downturn. And the reason why is really quite simple. It's because of the relationship between long-term and short-term interest rates. The yield curve is quite simply the difference between a long-term interest rate and a short-term interest rate. In most cases, the one used to predict a recession is the 10-year minus the 2-year yield curve. So you take the 10-year yield, you subtract the 2-year yield, and that gives you the yield curve. Now, the longer-term rate should almost always be higher. So the 10-year rate should be higher than the 2-year, and when you subtract the 2-year from the 10-year, you get a positive number. But sometimes that number turns negative. When the long-term rate is lower than the short-term rate, that gives you a negative result. And this is what's called an inverted yield curve. So let's say, for example, the 10-year rate is at 3% and the 2-year rate is at 4%. If you subtract the 2-year rate from the 10-year rate, it's 3% minus 4%, which gives you -1. That's an inverted yield curve. And it's at the point where that yield curve starts to uninvert that we see the economy start to have recessionary effects. And the reason why is because the short-term rates are more heavily influenced by the Federal Reserve. And the reason a yield curve typically inverts is because the Federal Reserve increases short-term interest rates in order to curb inflation. What happens as a result of that is the economy starts to slow down, inflation comes down, but inevitably we find ourselves in an economy where GDP stops growing. And it's all thanks to the things that the Federal Reserve did in order to cool the economy. And when you look at a chart, much like this one, of the yield curve, you can see that in almost every case where the yield curve went negative, so it dropped below the red line, a recession was almost guaranteed to follow within 12 to 18 months. You can see it in the 1980s, you can see it in the 1990s, you can see it in the early 2000s, you can see it prior to 2008, and you can see it kind of just before COVID. But now we're entering this period where the yield curve is once again uninverting, which is in all likelihood an indicator that in the next 12 to 18 months, we're probably going to see a recession. But the yield curve isn't the only indicator that is very successful at predicting recessions that is sounding the alarms. There are two more. The second most common one, and I'll get to the most interesting one at the end here, is what's called the Sahm rule. The Sahm rule is a measure of unemployment, and more precisely, trends in unemployment. And with the Sahm rule, you can see that once again, it is very good at predicting recessions. In fact, if you go back in time and you take a look at the 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s, 2007, 2008, and pre-COVID, well, the rule is always pretty much the same. When the Sahm rule is increasing, there's highly likely going to be a recession. And guess what? In the same way that the yield curve is uninverting, the Sahm rule is increasing, which points to the high likelihood that we are in fact heading towards a recession. But the Sahm rule and the yield curve have one thing in common. They both look at individual metrics. In one case, interest rates, in the other case, unemployment. But there is one more indicator that is almost always 100% accurate in predicting a recession. And this indicator is by far the single most robust, measuring not just one, not just two, but 10 different components of the economy in order to determine if a recession is around the corner. And it is the Conference Board's leading economic index. And as you can see from this chart, which graphs two different indexes, the leading economic index and the coincident economic index, which is a measure of what's actually happening in the economy, not what is about to happen in the economy, you can see that the blue line, the leading economic index, when it turns, typically within a period of 12 to 18 months, sometimes longer, you end up seeing the coincident economic index follow suit. You saw this in the early 2000s. You can see this leading up to 2008. You can see this during the pandemic. And right now, we are in fact seeing the leading economic index come down, which is a pretty good indication that at some point in the near future, the coincident economic index is also going to come down, which means we're probably going to find ourselves in a recession. And when you take a look at the leading economic index's 6-month growth rate, which graphs warning signals and recession signals, you can see that almost all the time when there's a recession signal, the economy is about to head into a recession. Now, sometimes when there's warning signals, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to end up there. What you can see right now is that we are in a period where the recession alarm bells have been ringing. We just haven't realized on the recession yet. But there's a high likelihood that it's about to come. Now, why this index is so much better than the other two at predicting a recession is because it measures more than one thing. For example, it measures 10 key components. It measures hours in manufacturing, initial claims for unemployment insurance, new orders for consumer goods and materials, building permits for private housing units, the S&P 500, the leading credit index, the index rate spread, so yes, the 10-year Treasury bond less federal funds rate, which is essentially the yield curve, and the average consumer expectations for business conditions, which is basically a consumer confidence index. So in comparison to the other indicators, this one is by far the most robust. But in an environment where all three of these economic indicators are typically correct in predicting a recession, and they're all pointing at this moment to a recession, it becomes clear that in all likelihood a recession is right around the corner. So the question is, how do you protect yourself? Because you can't sit here and worry about the next recession. Because if you take all of your money out of your investments expecting a recession, you could miss out on a pretty significant amount of returns. Or if you take all your money and put it in gold and silver or Bitcoin, you could end up seeing a collapse in those investments while missing out on stock market gains. So instead, what you need to do is you need to diversify your investments. Look at things like the all-weather portfolio, where you're diversifying for risk. And you're also minimizing the drawdowns that you will see if there is in fact a recession. And if you are in a position where you have debt, you are in a position where you are spending more than you earn, or where your lifestyle is simply at a point where it is unavoidable, well, the thing that will protect you from the next big recession is by being proactive today before it hits. And by the way, if you want to see a video on what always happens before a financial crisis, make sure you check out this one right here.